Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. A very warm welcome to everybody in very large numbers in the room here today and also online. This is the opening event of the Global Strategy Forum's 2022-2023 programme, and our subject today is Afghanistan 1 year on. So a particularly warm welcome to our panel today. On my far left, Lieutenant General Giles Hill, and just next to me, Ambassador Stefano Pontecovo, and I will introduce both of them in a moment or two. Before we get going, there are, as usual, some parish notices, and I'd like to start by just advertising our next event, which will be on Tuesday, the 1st of November, and there we'll see Professor Sir Lawrence Freedman in conversation with his son, Sam Freedman. They will mostly, I hope, be talking about Sir Lawrence's new book, which is called Command: The Politics of Military Operations from Korea to Ukraine. And as many of you will know, that pair also have a wildly successful Substack where they talk about a lot of political and policy and foreign affairs called Comment is Freed, and I imagine the conversation will therefore stray beyond the book. That event will be hosted by my fellow GSF Advisory Board member, Professor Michael Clark, and will take place live in this room, again at 1 o'clock on the 1st of November, and will be online as well. Invitations to come out soon. Returning to today, today is a hybrid event, although for the first time for about 3 years, there are more people in the room than there are online. So for those of you attending by Zoom, this is a view-only event. And in a change to some of our past events, if you are online and you want to ask a question, please put it in the chat and it will appear on the giant laser board screen thing here, and we will mix it in with the live questions. If you're in the room and you want to ask a question, please try and catch my eye and I will run that process. But please wait for the microphone to turn up in your hands so that the people online can hear what it is that you're asking. We will be recording this event. It will be available afterwards on the GSF website, which is in lowercase globalstrategyforum.org, and that will take you to the YouTube channel, and it will be on Twitter on our account, which is #GSF Events Day, as usual. And finally, in the parish notices, as I mentioned, this is the start of the new season, and that also means it's subscription time. Particularly now that we have so many more people turning up for the live events, which involves a greater bill for sausages, essentially, we just cannot do that if we don't keep the subscriptions coming in. So please have a look at yours. And if you know of someone else who would like to join, or there is someone here online who isn't a member, please speak to Jacqueline and we will iron that out very quickly. So let me turn to our two speakers. I'm going to start with Giles, Lieutenant General Giles Hill. He's a paratrooper. He commanded at every level from platoon commander to 3-star in airborne, conventional and special forces. He had the distinction of commanding the UK's 16 Air Assault Brigade and the 1st Armoured Division in the UK, and has plenty of experience at senior level in US and coalition headquarters, and as many of his generation, operational experience in Northern Ireland, the Balkans, Iraq and Afghanistan. All of that is fabulous. The main reason he is with us today is that from 2019 to 2021, an especially long tour, in fact, he was the Deputy Commander of the 40-nation international coalition in Afghanistan and the UK's most senior deployed operational commander during the period of the Doha process, more of which no doubt to come, and the drawdown of forces. He's now recently left the army, sits on the board of various companies, there can always be more, and has his own strategy, risk and leadership advisory company. To my immediate left, Ambassador Stefano Pontecovo. He's obviously an Italian diplomat, but with a long record of distinguished service in European and international roles over about 40 years. He served as the Italian ambassador to Pakistan, and as the deputy in both Moscow and London, so well acquainted with London's traffic. He served in the European Union and in NATO, and was Rome's Deputy Director General for Africa, and was the diplomatic advisor to the succession of Italian Ministers of Defence. The main reason that Stefano is here today is he was NATO's last senior civilian representative for Afghanistan from June 2020. So he represented the alliance in the Doha peace process. And in his last days in Kabul, he was ensuring the continued operability of the international airport, the flow of 18,000 evacuees a day, making up the 124,000 people that got out in those astonishing few weeks. He's a writer, has written a book. It's called, in Italian, The Last Airplane from Kabul, and our ambition is to get that published in English. He appears regularly on TV, and he teaches at university level. And of course, he has his own company now providing international strategic advice. So this combination of Giles and Stefano, who better to talk to us about Afghanistan 1 year on? And the format we're going to follow is I'm going to ask Giles to talk for 10 minutes, then Stefano to talk for 10 minutes, and then we'll be into questions. I will, of course, steal the first one, as is traditional, and we'll take all the time we can up till 2 o'clock. So, without further ado, Giles.
So Richard, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to come and talk. The first time I've talked about it since I left Afghanistan, and I will take it from a journey from three perspectives through the last year. So I'm not going to go pre-evacuation. We can raise that in questions, you know, how we got to that point, but really look at the year that was, 1 year on. Had a look at that through the internal Afghan perspective, the perspective of the West, perhaps an international perspective, and then some comments on the Taliban. And I was talking to a well-informed Afghan this morning, and I said I was giving a few comments on 1 year on, and he said, very interesting, because actually in the last year we've almost completed the journey back to 2001. Which I think is at the heart of, this is not necessarily about progress. There's a military saying that nothing is ever as good or as bad as it first seems. That's a moot point with regard to Afghanistan. So I'll limit my comments firstly on, if you like, the latest chapter in over 50 years of turbulence and conflict from an Afghan situation. Pick your evidence. There are now a number of reports that detail, and Afghanistan didn't have a long way to fall, but it's fallen further, and it's now overtaken Yemen to the #1 spot in the world's list of worst humanitarian crises. And you can go to a number of other pretty catastrophic examples of how far it's fallen. Pure humanitarian aid is not ameliorating the situation. And in my view won't, it can't, it's just not of a scale without effective governance. Doing more of that, particularly development, is proving over the last year challenging, and I've talked to a number of development companies who've been, in their words, kind of scrabbling to reconfigure their programs and their funding amidst a legal, ethical and practical minefield. It's not easy to provide the kind of support that Afghans need. The view of Afghans themselves, who are now in a country led by the Taliban, is less well documented. There are people in the audience who've recently been to Afghanistan. I'm, to be honest, a little bit out of date, but I do talk to a lot of Afghans. There are not many surveys that are credible, one soon to be published, so I won't lean on it too much, but this was 5,000 people under 40, predominantly urban, but also rural. And the statistics, 80% after a year see the behaviour of the Taliban as generally unacceptable. And of course, this is a Taliban who purported to speak for the vast majority of Afghans. That was their selling point. 70% of those that haven't left, and those that could leave probably have, would leave now if they could. 90% disagree with the girls' education policy. Interestingly, a third equal split, so kind of 30-30-30 split to the current legitimacy of armed resistance. So Afghans already tired of conflict are beginning to exhibit the answers that seem they're dwindling in their belief of the Taliban, and tiredness has a limit. And whilst Taliban victory may not have been inevitable in the views of many, I think their sustainability is not inevitable. And of course, Afghans have a history of pushing back against oppressive political models. So I don't sense personally from those I speak to that the resentment is growing to the extent that it will translate into widespread popular resistance, but it's more than it was a year ago. And of course, a lot of Afghans were no fan of the Republic. A lot of them did speak to me about a different model, but it doesn't seem to me that model is delivering. So there's the journey from the perspective of Afghans. Things have not got better despite some expectation, I think, that it would. In terms of the West, well, let's just touch on the security situation. I think for a lot of Afghans, the security situation has got a little bit better. The Taliban are using kind of immediate quashing. They do have a monopoly on power, and their surging capability to quash anything that pops up pretty quickly and frankly pretty effectively. ISIS have not disappeared. They present both the Taliban and the population a threat, and you've just got to read the news for this constant stream of devastating attacks, particularly in Kabul. And again, I sense that Kabul is becoming less safe. And of course, from our perspective, Al-Qaeda, we saw, I think it was the 31st of July, the US strike on the global leader of AQ. That was, I think, significant. And of course, a lot of the Doha deal is now consigned to history. The one part of the Doha deal that has longevity is the Taliban commitment as part of that deal to not invite, host, tolerate foreign or indigenous terrorist organisations. And I think we disbelieved, certainly I disbelieved them then. And I think the Zawahiri strike has just added to that sense of disbelief. They don't seem to have managed to break their ties with the global jihadist community. It still seems that is evidence that they're mired in a wartime mindset and have yet to shed those connections, even though they signed up to the commitment, the responsibility to do so. And of course, the response of the US, Frank McKenzie, the recently retired commander of CENTCOM, who took over from Scott Miller, the US commander in those final months, described outside-in counterterrorism, over-the-horizon counterterrorism, really at the limits of even the US's capability. He described it, I think, as not impossible, but very difficult. And I think probably the last year has seen evidence of that challenge. So there's the internal security and the broader international security challenge, which has not got better. In terms of the West, not to dismiss the efforts of many, but I think, and many tell me there is a policy of engagement, and you can see evidence of that, but it's mid-level, it's calibrated. To a large extent, it's focused on safe passage or narrow national security or aid. There doesn't seem to be a commitment for much more than that. And with no local imperative from an international perspective, the bandwidth of re-emergence of US Sino tensions, of Ukraine, there's a kind of sucking up of oxygen that is preventing focus on Afghanistan, but there's also a reluctance, just because of the complexity of it, but just of the pain of it, I think, and I think a lot of capitals have moved on. My worry is that is the foothills of yet another cycle of a devastating cycle of interest and neglect, which I think has blighted Afghanistan and the region for a number of decades. I think if we draw a lesson from that right now, and I won't kind of peer too much into the future, I think Stefano's going to do a little bit of that. But this instinct to move on, and we've done it before, the instinct to move on from difficult campaigns is evidenced through history, from Vietnam to the Balkans to a lot of other places. But Afghanistan has a habit of coming back to bite us, and therefore I think the ability to not do an analytical drawdown, even if it's a kind of political disengagement, I think we need to think very hard about finding the right balance and not letting the pendulum swing too far that we lose understanding and the ability to engage and discuss the issue. Regionally, I think, really quick, the region is still adjusting to the events of last year. Most, I think, were caught short without a plan, given the nature of last August. For many, I think the assurances and expectations have not materialised for many. But I think regionally there is a deep hesitancy of any course of action that might push Afghanistan back towards civil war. And so regional approaches perhaps could be summarised as cautious but near universal pragmatic engagement. And so long as the Taliban manage to contain the worst case regional scenarios, neighbours might well prove more patient than some others. And then finally on the Taliban, we were discussing it last night, their journey over the last year, how have they coped with the challenges? Many hoped, I think, that the Doha sophisticated public face of the Taliban, to many a wiser, better travelled, social media savvy Taliban would strive to avoid the dire mistakes of their 94, 96, 2001 rule, that it had the Taliban, not an entity, but the franchise had evolved, that there was, to use common phrase, a Taliban 2.0, that was better than the 1.0, that the moderates would prevail over the hardliners. I don't think that's the case. What was very clear to me throughout the Doha process was that the Taliban had no clear view of the emirate that they were proposing. They didn't want to and couldn't describe it, because that would force them to table some really existential issues. They were focused on cohesion, and as long as they were fighting the war, they could operate in a very distributed, horizontal system that was very effective in counterinsurgency. What they didn't do was table some of the real existential issues, like how were they going to run a country? What were going to be the challenges of running a state, an independent, strong, functioning Afghan state, and a pure Islamic state? And those two will always exist in some form of dynamic tension. For me, the important point, and people say, well, it's a matter of time, and they lack capacity, and they were the dog that caught the car. They didn't quite know what to do, given the nature of their military victory, that it was a surprise to them as it was to anybody else. And, it was a tough challenge. Yes, they lack inclusiveness, ethnically, organisationally, yes, and those maybe are a matter of time to evolve. What I don't think is a matter of time is that the challenges and the things we are expecting of the Taliban are political evolutions. And they're not a political organisation, they're an ideological organisation, and we're asking them to make ideological changes. And that seems to me, as Hibatullah, the emir, has come to the fore and made the pronouncements on girls' education, on engagement with the West, on some regional issues, that they are defaulting to the ultra-conservative, purist ideological wing. And despite some moderates in the Taliban that maybe are the points of discussion, of evolution, I hate to use the term moderation in the same breath as the Taliban, but where those do exist, they are being crushed by this purist ideology, and I don't think that that is a matter of evolution. How they manage that is going to be very interesting. Despite of this dysfunction, despite of the rumbling dissent, despite of that bogged downness with contradictions, and there are plenty, I don't think that internally has escalated to the level of grievance that threatens fracture, my personal opinion. And I don't think anyone yet is in the Taliban willing to openly challenge the moral superiority of the ideological struggle that got them where they are in the first place. So it seems to me they have the capability, they have the willingness, and they have the current exclusive hold on political power for the foreseeable future. So after a year, quickly looking at the Afghans, the international perspective, and the Taliban, I think we're left with a very narrow aid in as much as we can over the horizon CT approach, and we learned from the 90s that that may not be enough to avert the causes of conflict that have plagued the region for a long time. Thank you.
Giles, thank you. Your career in stand-up comedy has some way to go just yet. Ambassador.
Sure. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here, especially with an old friend like Giles, with whom we passed a year in Kabul. And excuse my terrible accent in speaking English, American English actually. And I'll try to dissipate the fact that putting a microphone in the hands of a diplomat is generally an act of supreme masochism. So I'll go by points. And I agree with fully with what Giles said repeatedly. So Afghanistan is one of those problems that if you don't deal with it, it will deal with you. And some countries in the region are seeing this already. However we approach this, and we don't have many angles and we don't have many levers, I have never believed, and actually I was on the minority side, but I think I was right, on saying we had no economic leverage whatsoever with the Taliban when the legend was in Doha. The Americans and the rest of us offered billions in aid and US aid and the EU and everything against certain concessions of the Taliban that the Taliban were supposed to make, and that was considered a lever. It never was a lever, as diplomatic recognition is not a lever either, because the Taliban first are well advised by people who know that de facto authorities, it's full of de facto authorities, and I think that the British have set up a great handbook on how you deal with de facto authorities without recognizing. The Taliban are simply not interested in recognizing. They would be interested in recognition, as they showed on the 14th. We're in the airport. You were in your beautiful house in York. I was in the airport on the 14th and 15th when Zal and Khalizad and Al-Qahtani, the Qatari representative, special envoy, who had a role that has not yet been, fully magnified for what he actually did, were negotiating a transitional government, which would have given which Ghani had agreed to, by the way, and then he left the day after without saying anything to anybody, including two of his closest aides, which were left in Kabul to deal with the Talibs. At that point, they were still kind of interested in a transitional government that would have given them recognition and a continuation of international assistance and so on, but not that much even then. When the deal collapsed because Ghani left, nobody in the Taliban camp shed any tears about it, because, and here I come back to one of the things which Giles was hinting at, the Talibs, we are taking this, I think, in our way, which is seeing what we can do to help the Talibs reconstruct Afghanistan. The Talibs at this stage are not interested in reconstructing Afghanistan. They are interested in constructing a society. their Medina. I've seen this. The first time I set foot in Afghanistan, I was 3 years old. My father bought the embassy. I'm the son of a diplomat. Nobody's perfect. I'm a diplomat myself. My father's the one that bought the embassy. So I was ambassador to Pakistan. The first time I set foot in Pakistan, I was 8 years old. So I know the region pretty well, as probably some of you. The Taliban have a completely ideological, which is a very difficult ideology even for the countries in the region, because they have, sorry, this is not COVID, this is my cigar, which is in Islam, which is seen through the prism of their Pakhtunwali, of the Pashtun code of conduct. And this, and I'll come to the treatment of women in a while at the end, because this is a very interesting, what's going on in the Muslim world is pretty interesting. And that may be the kind of lever that uncovers the Talibs, but differently than others, when the Talibs are in difficulty, they shoot. Others are less how can I say, less brutal. The Taliban are really brutal because they have this ideological and religious foundation. Now, I don't believe for a single moment that all the Taliban are religiously motivated. 3/4 of them are illiterate, don't know what they're fighting for. They know they're fighting for 15,000, now it's gone up to 18,000 Afghanis per month. The reason for which Al-Qaeda and ISIS are doing better is simply because they pay double. We caught somebody, so that is the truth of it. Each and every one, I've met out of the 23 from Mullah Baradar down, in the 23 members of the Taliban political commission, it was called, which were stationed in Doha. 23 out of 23 have businesses set up with external help. And I can even tell you of some of them, what the business names are, what they do, carpet selling and big import-export. So coming back to the point, most of these people are not religiously motivated. 3/4 are not. But some are, and those are the ones which have the guns, the ability of using them very well, and the economic and the religious drive to keep things as they are. So the first point I want to make is, let's not take it from the nation building point of view, let's not take it from the from any other view that is not the humanitarian assistance. And there I think that the regional states, which are the only ones which have some leverage, little leverage. I used to be the Italian ambassador in Pakistan. I'm still involved. I consult a few companies which work in Pakistan, especially in the defense industry. I work with the military. They are, the Pakistani military, they are very concerned about what's going on in Pakistan, in Afghanistan. But I'll get to that later. The only national policy that the Talibs are taking forward is the security. If you look at it, it's not a national. They're building an army, they're building special forces, they're building a number of entities in the security field, police, a new police. They're rebuilding what we dismantled, I think you dismantled it, the Afghan National, the local police, the ANP, the Afghan National Police, which was a complete failure. But they're rebuilding it because that is a way to keep their fighters engaged and with a legitimate salary. And what they are doing also to perpetrate the society they're building is they are keeping girls out of school, but they have requisitioned, I read somewhere, 1,000 public buildings to turn them into madrasa to create the next generation of, in the whole country, less in the north where that's more Tajiks and Uzbeks, which are reigning in Hazarajat. There are the Shias, but it's going on there too. They have requisitioned actually a number of around 1,000. I heard buildings to turn them into madrasa, which will churn out the new fighters and the ideologues of the of the future emirate. The Talibs are divided. I think this is something which was evident on the 15th. On the 15th, we had news that once Ghani had left the country, let's say fled the country. The Russians say with $169 million. I don't think that's true. The $169 million is more than the four helicopters, which are the maximum number that flew out of the country on that day on the flight radars. He might have flown away with some money, he might have not, I don't know. But on that day, we were told in Kabul that from Doha the order had arrived that Mullah Baradar Sahib would have come back from Doha and on the orders of the Emir in person would have marched triumphantly into Kabul, which they did without shooting a single shot. Whereas what happened was that in the end, Baradar didn't take the plane, and on the 15th afternoon, the Haqqanis, not Sirajuddin Haqqani, who is an Al-Qaeda member and the foreign minister, is one of the four top leaders of Al-Qaeda and is currently the interior minister of Afghanistan, ordered his uncle to walk in and take the city, which they did, and then they took up the posts on the outskirts and the most lucrative posts on the outskirts of the town, and then let Baradar in when they came in. Already then, the Haqqanis had contravened a direct order of the Emir. And from then on, it's all gone downhill. We have read on the newspapers that Baradar was literally beaten up in his palace. He left for Kandahar and then came back, which is another proof of the fact that of what Giles was saying, is that they presented to us the Talibs who were actually were prestigious. Mullah Baradar, just for those who don't remember, was the gentleman who founded, together with other four people, with Mullah Omar and there were five in all. Mullah Omar, Mullah Baradar, and other four of them. They founded the Taliban, Kandahar, and Mullah Baradar was the guy who was driving the motorcycle when Mullah Omar left under siege by the Afghans. So he was somebody who had a certain prestige. He had been for 10 years in Pakistani prison in Karachi, but he was pulled out on request of Khalizad, who had known him personally. They're both Nurzais. Zal and himself are Nurzai tribe of the Pashtuns, and so they had connections, and not family connections, but otherwise. And Zal had understood that he was a guy who had thought that he was a guy that could bring the Talibs with him at the negotiating table, which more or less worked until it worked, and then it collapsed. So the Talibs are, and by the way, you mentioned Haibatullah, who is the Emir. Nobody has seen him. It is not normal that the head of state of a country is not seen in public ever. He was probably seen, and they have been in power since a year. He signs pieces of paper, which are accepted by the other Talibs, so that's good enough. But it is not normal that a head of state, a recognized head of state by everybody, doesn't ever appear, not even in photograph. He was seen once getting off a car, and photographed once actually, apparently, getting off a car and going into a house in Kandahar. Never again in a year has been seen, which to me and to my friends, I mean, we both have probably the same friends in Kabul and in Afghanistan, it tells me that there is a big division if he comes out and if he started speaking, he would have to take position on a number of issues on which he either has no authority, which is a possibility, remote, but is a possibility, or cannot cannot express himself. That doesn't mean that you can't deal with the Talibs. You can deal with the Taliban for limited issues and for limited objectives. Another episode which Giles has mentioned, al-Zawahiri. And on that, as we say in Italian, open and close a parenthesis, the Taliban would dispute what you say, because the Taliban say that in the Hanafi code, which they follow, an agreement between two parties has to be followed, not in the spirit, but in the letter. In the letter of the agreement, it's written that you cannot invite. Zawahiri was already in. The first time he was seen, it was in March 2019, close to Kandahar. And it's not me that says it, but people who should know these things better than I do. And second, that what the agreement says is that they will not allow Afghanistan to be used as a basis for attacks against the US and its allies. So they say, we have kept our agreement. And I've heard that personally 4 times at least by the the highest political level of the Taliban with whom I spoke to. So Zawahiri, rumors go, was somebody told the Americans that Zawahiri was there. By the way, the balcony on which he was taken out, I know it pretty well because I used to smoke my cigars on that balcony was a balcony of the, how do you call it, forestry, of the apartment of the head of the police of Kabul. So that was in the middle of, that's institutional. So Zawahiri was actually it is unthinkable that he was there without the police force of Kabul, at least the higher echelons, were aware of it. It was unthinkable that they weren't aware of it. So that gives you an idea of the mingling of Al-Qaeda and the Afghan authorities. I mean, the police is pretty effective, and we see it every day. I mean, the people who are beating up the protesters, those few protesters, they are the ones who are taken out yesterday. I think 1,000 or so they claimed, day before yesterday, they claimed to have arrested 1,000 drug addicts. Those are all the police. So they're pretty effective by Taliban standards. They knew perfectly well that al-Zawahiri was there. As they know perfectly well, there are in Afghanistan currently, latest report of the UN, 18 recognized terrorist organizations which are in Afghanistan, which go for some names we've never heard of: IMU, Islamic Movement Uzbekistan, ETIM, East Turkmenistan Islamic Movement. We're probably all experts in terrorists. I've become one being in Pakistan and Afghanistan. TTP, the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, but there are 18 of them, and they move freely around, and drug lords, and a number of, I'm told that a couple of big criminal bosses moved from Malaysia and Thailand to Afghanistan because they have freer movement in Afghanistan. I don't know if it's true, but that's what from Afghanistan they're telling me. So Afghanistan has actually become a wasteland. Terrorism, drugs, 90% of opiums, which is on the illegal drug markets, come from Herat, Kandahar, and Lashkar-Gah, that area, which has always been controlled by the Taliban. Criminality is rampant. So what can we do about this? As we are learning from the countries in the region, not very much. Now, the countries in the region are, and for the countries in the region, I include Russia. I mean China, Pakistan, Iran, which has a long reach into Afghanistan. It has a lot of, it has, you know, the Iranians, notwithstanding their Shias, and the Talibs are 100% now Sunnis, because they had one Shia leader, which was taken out during a conflict up in the north and Badakhshan region. The Iranian regime has always had an excellent relationship with the Talibs, to the extent that the last emir before Ayatollah, which was his name was Mullah Mansour, whose businesses, by the way, are going up for sale in buildings and so on in Karachi this month, just to underline the point that these are all big businessmen. Mullah Mansour is the son of a stable hand and has ended up with a number of apartments, not in London, but in Karachi, which is good enough for him, and which are worth millions of dollars, by the way, and businesses do. He was taken out 15 miles in Pakistan after having crossed by car the frontier coming from Tehran between Iran and Pakistan and Balochistan. And he had gone to speak with the Iranian leadership. So they had pretty strong contact. Mansour was different. Akhundzada is more of a, is more of a reclusive figure. Mansour was more, he's not a fighter. Akhundzada is a scholar. Mansour was a military commander, and so he moved around a lot more than Akhundzada did. But, sorry?
1 minute.
1 minute. Okay. I'll end with this, then. Then I'll answer questions. Women. Not much the issue of how the Taliban are treating them. They're treating them not through Islamic lenses, but through lenses of Pakhtunwali. Their code of honor says that you have to defend the honor of your women. The way they do it is to cover them completely with, by the way, somebody may know this already, with a, what's it called, a burqa, which is a pre-Islamic invention. It was invented in Persia at the time, as before Islam. They used to stone adulteresses, which left a lot of orphans. So governor of Arya at the time it was, thought up the burqa to keep the adulteress alive, to feed the children and not have a lot of orphans which are dying of hunger in the road. And that then evolved into keeping them, ashamed, so to speak, of their actions, but alive to be able to cure their children. And but that evolved into a kind of, what is now, which is an instrument of oppression. What is going on is very interesting. Iran, I don't know how many of you saw it yesterday, day before yesterday. The Saudi Arabia has come out ruling that women who wanted to go on Hajj alone, without the muharram, without the a male member of the family, can do so. That is an epochal change in attitude by the Saudi authorities. I think that, that was a telling, what Giles said was a very telling statistic. 90% of people in Afghanistan are against the Taliban ruling, which does not allow girls in school. I think that, the positive, if there's a positive in the Afghan situation currently, is that, when we walked into Afghanistan, there were 40,000, we as NATO, there were 40,000 people in school, kids in school. We left, there were 6 million, of which half were women. So we have, and that was for the 15 years before us, we went up very quickly from 40,000 to 1 million, then 2 and 3, and so on. These are all people that have been exposed to a kind of society and thinking which the Taliban are not offering, and which are seeing now that same education being denied to their sons and daughters, and they are reacting. So that can be the glimmer of hope in the Afghan situation, is not something imposed from outside. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. We've seen it. The Russians tried, we tried, it doesn't work. But, this isolation done by the neighbors is also a way of letting things mature, I think, in Afghanistan and seeing if society itself will not overthrow, but it's not going to happen, but will convince the Talibs to kind of redress their situation.
Thank you. Positive note. So we have some time for questions. Aim to start with one in the room. Shall we start with the lady here in the front? Hold on, the microphone needs to approach, and it's coming.
Thank you. Thelma Matuk. I'm not quite clear what the Taliban wants to do with Afghanistan for the next 10 years. If you could just explain more about the strategy. Do they want to keep in isolation? Do they want to get onto the global stage? If you could just add
No, I think, Taliban are not the problem because they are nationalistic. Their interest ends at the frontier with Afghanistan. And the frontier with Afghanistan is Spin Boldak. It's not part of Pakistan. It's not the greater Pashtunistan. It's Afghanistan as it is now. If you want to read, if you want to know what the Taliban want, is if you read the Prophet, peace be upon him, his description of the Medina, that's what they're looking for. That's exactly what they're looking for. It's an Islamic society.
A few weeks ago, I was watching on YouTube a video of General Lord Richards. At the time, he was the reviewing officer at Sandhurst, and the interview was at Sandhurst, in which he predicted that the outcome in Afghanistan would be very good in favour of us. Obviously words which he now bitterly, I suspect, regrets, but does that indicate that at the time there was a somewhat hubristic belief amongst the Western powers in the outcome in Afghanistan, and that the ultimate debacle was entirely anticipated or anticipatory?
I'm going to ask Giles to start, since we were part of that conspiracy. Yeah.
I personally don't think what happened was inevitable. I think we were perhaps, if we're honest, all part of a conspiracy of some form of optimism. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. When you're dealing with complex problems, I do think that what we were trying to achieve was achievable in time. It proved it wasn't achievable in the time available politically. And I think that mismatch between ambition and opportunity, political time, because it was a political choice, an American political choice to finish. And I don't make a comment on that. That's for politicians and others to comment on, but I don't think it was unachievable. So I think some of the optimism at the time was reasonable. It's just proved, predicting the future's tricky.
Oh, just 20 seconds on that. At the time in which the prediction was made, probably was the second Karzai government. At the time, it could have worked. Look, the Republic had a number of flaws, starting with the fact that it was a republic. If it had been the king, Zahir Shah, things would have been entirely different. But that is a decision we owe, has a name and a surname, Donald Rumsfeld, who did not want the king. The Brits would have wanted the king, but Karzai was good enough. Because Karzai, in the hierarchy of Afghanistan, Karzai is a Bopalzai, which explains a lot. Karzai is the most noble man in Afghanistan from, lineage. Whereas, strangely enough, both Najibullah, who was the hanged president, and Ghani are two Gilzais. The tribal angle is always very Gilzais, the saying goes, hand over power to the Taliban, because Najibullah was hung by the Taliban. It could have worked had we had strategic patience, had a gentleman in the White House not considered that he would get 2.5 points in his ballots, had he retired, had he brought the boys back home and ending the endless war at the height of the electoral campaign. It didn't work out for him, but that was the calculus. And if we had fought corruption. Afghanistan has never been corrupt. Had never been corrupt. It had been, the saying goes that you can't buy an Afghan, but you can rent him. Rent means that they give a service. Brits know him. I think that's not true, by the way, because there's a lot of honest Afghans. Number of them, the majority, the vast majority. But that's why in my book I say the mistakes which we committed or we allowed people to commit, and the major mistake was corruption, in which nobody bought into the Republic. But at the moment in which the judgment was given, I would have given the same judgment. It could have worked. You need 40 years. You're building something from scratch, imposing Switzerland on Afghanistan, because that was a process, or the US or France, because it was a very highly centralized government, whereas Afghanistan had been in peace for 300 years when it was delocalized. Give yourself time.
Next question.
Hajib, Center for Euro-Mediterranean and African Studies. General, you mentioned that there was security was one of the major concerns of the Taliban. How come that the Western Alliance did not actually monitor the security situation in Afghanistan before the rundown of the Taliban? And also, Ambassador, you mentioned that the model of republic that you mentioned was not well received by the Afghans. Does that mean that they want a monarchy? Thank you.
I'm not sure I understand, so the question that we didn't monitor the security?
The security arrangement on the spot, because they obviously they just run down completely and took over, and by surprise, it took everybody by surprise, and everybody just left hurriedly. How come that there was no time to actually monitor that situation and know that there is time to leave comfortably without having to rush out as it was done at the time?
Well, the ambassador was there at the time, maybe have a kind of more insight to that, but essentially it was an unexpected but rapid political collapse.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of unfortunate comment on the ANDSF, the Afghan National Defence and Security Forces. We shouldn't forget that they fought very hard for their country for a very long time. And if we just try and apply some statistics to that, it was taking the Afghans 18 days to suffer the same number of deaths that the British military took in the entire commitment to Afghanistan. It was taking them 18 months to accrue the same number of deaths as the Soviets took in 10 years. And I fought with them, alongside them, very bravely. But militaries don't exist in isolation. They need a political project to believe in. Militaries consist of a moral component. Interestingly, I think we're seeing the power of that in Ukraine, and just what a contrast a powerful moral component is, irrespective of the physical and conceptual elements of a military. So what we saw was the breakdown of the moral component, which was vested in a governance system that collapsed very quickly and unexpectedly. Very difficult to foresee that coming.
No, that's correct, and there is a very telling New York Times editorial by Sami Sadat, who was an excellent general. Giles, you trained him. An excellent general. He was the head of the head of the Special Forces, and then Chief of Defense.
The Afghan Corps commander in Helmand, all the way to the end, and
that's why you knew him, right?
Commanded Special Forces as well.
Then commander, and then he became Chief of Defense. And his editorial starts, "We were betrayed," which is the truth.
By who?
He says by the Americans, but he has, especially by his own politicians, which was completely correct. And I was the guy who used to go and talk to the President Ghani, who is a person who I liked quite a lot. I mean, he was quite dispersive, but a guy who knew everything about everything, but he really did, except on how you govern a country, which was a problem. And he had a very bad relationship with the military. terrible relationship with them, which is not a good idea when you're in war, to have a terrible relationship with an instrument that keeps you in power. So it is true. I mean, I put in the last part of my book one of your phrases, which is what Napoleon used to say, that moral is to technical 3 to 1. And the Afghans in the end, the Afghan military in the end lost faith in the Republic. Last number on this, to my knowledge, before the Doha Agreement, the Afghan armed forces, the NDSF, did not lose one single battle with the Talibs, not one. After, it was completely different. Also because support came down and the helicopters didn't fly and a number of issues. As concerns your question to me, the Afghans would have wanted a monarchy, no doubt. They would have wanted a monarchy. There was a point, I mean, in the end, I'm pretty critical because it's easy to be critical 20 years later and so on. I see the logic of having to reconstruct a country and so wanting to have a strong centralized power that can do it, and that was Karzai, who was pretty efficient, also because he had standing and status. They didn't want the king, the Americans. They got the second best, which Karzai, which was in his first years he was okay. Then, a number of contradictions came in, and the main one was that for the US, at least until 2014, this was war on terror, full stop. That was it. We were there for institution building, the rest of NATO to build this and that, and to make the lot of the women better, and everything. All you can think of, we were trying to do it. For the US, it was war on terror. So the US kept in power locally, empowered, not kept in power, empowered. I was using the wrong word. Successive administrations, so it's not, Republicans or Democrats or the military it was a national policy. A number of warlords, which would have helped against the Talibs, against Al-Qaeda, against ISIS didn't exist at the time, and so on. So you had on one side, a strong centralized power, and Karzai was strong. He was really strong. He was credible. He was a great person, and he's courageously still living in Afghanistan together with Dr. Abdullah. On one side, on the other side, you had a number of warlords. I met them all, from Hekmatyar to, well, let's not name names on television, I was saying, who knew they were on the good books of the major power. So we had to juggle between these two, and it wasn't easy for him. Plus then corruption erupted, and I keep going about it. I come from a country who has lost 600 parliamentarians to a corruption scandal within the years. Corruption erodes everything, believe me. Erodes, and in Afghanistan, I'm Italian, I know what I'm talking about. Luckily, it's no longer like this. We've turned the page, and we're probably a lot better than, without special laws, a lot better than any other country in Europe. I think the corruption level in Italy is a lot lower, but we have had 4 prime ministers, one died in exile, and another couple, we had 4 justice ministers jailed, and as I say, half of the parliament has gone to jail. In Afghanistan, it was worse, and that is what brought it down in the end, and that was the biggest mistake we made.
We're going to try, just got time for one more question only, I fear, and then our time will be up.
Nicholas Armour, just a quick question. Pakistan, how important is the solution in Afghanistan? Are the elements within the government there got a coherent plan? Do we know what it is, and how do we help shape it?
The Pakistanis are very concerned because, the TTP, the Pakistanis have, first of all, they had an issue, the Pashtuns are 45 million in all, and the Pashtuns are pretty unruly people, and are proud to be unruly. 15 million of those are in Afghanistan and 30 million are in Pakistan. So there are more Pashtuns. Imran Khan, who was the prime minister at my time, I had Mian Sab and then Imran Khan. Now is Shahbaz, is Mian's, the former prime minister, by the way, is here in London getting health checks and so on. They were quite concerned about the fact, between Afghanistan and Pakistan, there is not a recognized border. There is a Durand line, which Duran was a British geographer which pulled the line and pulled it in the middle of what some Pashtuns in Afghanistan believe should be Pashtunistan, which is, the Pashtun lands of Afghanistan and the Pashtun lands of Pakistan. Now, the Taliban that are not drumming the Pashtunistan thing, so that has gone away, the Pashtunistan theme, so that has gone away. What has remained is a TTP, the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, who have killed, since the Taliban are in power, I think upwards of 200 Pakistani soldiers. They have sworn allegiance to the Afghan Emir. And they are actually, the Taliban have tried to sort out things. There was a ceasefire which then collapsed, and the Pakistanis are pretty concerned. They have had a stabilizing role. Zal Khalizad himself recognizes that had it not been for the Pakistanis, the Taliban would not have come to the table. The truth of the matter is that Taliban believed that God was on their side and they won legitimately without anybody's help. So that gives you, is it tactical, is it true, doesn't matter. That's what they say and that's what they believe. It doesn't give anybody a big chance in a big say in Afghan affairs. Nobody. Pakistanis are closer to certain factions than to others, so they say. Doesn't make a big difference. Also because, when you talk with the Taliban, you never know if the Taliban represents who he represents other than himself. That's a big problem.
So, Ambassador General, thank you so much. I have learned a huge amount, and we could have spent another hour here, but our hour is up. So thank you to everyone who came in today. Thank you for people being online, and especially thank you for you two for uncovering some of the mysteries of this very difficult issue. Thank you very much.